He stood at his father's grave with the two people he trusted most in the world standing right beside him, his best friend of 22 years on his left, his fiancée on his right, and neither one of them was who he thought they were. Not even close. By the time Ethan Cole found out the truth, he had already lost his inheritance, his business future, and nearly everything his father had spent 40 years building. But here is the part that will stay with you. The people who took it from him were not strangers. They were the people he would have died for without thinking twice. And the one person who had been quietly protecting him the entire time was someone he had written off as gone forever. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The first thing you need to understand about Ethan Cole is that he was not a man who made enemies. If you had met him in 2005, living in Columbus, Ohio, working as a commercial property analyst and coaching youth basketball on weekends at a recreation center in his neighborhood, you would have said, "This is a man who is going to be fine." He was disciplined, well-liked, and he showed up consistently for people who had no way to repay him. He paid his bills on time. He called his mother every Sunday morning without fail. He was exactly the kind of man that people describe at funerals as someone who deserved so much better than what life handed him. And what life handed Ethan Cole, more than anything else, was a father who had already decided that Ethan was not the chosen one. That decision had been made long before Ethan could have done a single thing to change it. It was made the day his older brother, Marcus Cole, came into the world. Marcus was the firstborn son of Richard Cole, a man who had built a real estate development company from nothing in the 1970s and grown it over decades into a portfolio valued at above $240 million by 2003. Richard Cole was demanding, calculating, and deeply traditional in the way certain men of his generation were traditional. He believed a business was only as strong as the son who inherited it, and he had already chosen which son that would be. Marcus Cole was 4 years older than Ethan. He was charming in a way that entire rooms responded to. He was not particularly disciplined or detail-oriented, but he understood how to make a person feel important. In business, that skill will take you further than intelligence in many cases, and Richard saw himself in Marcus completely. Whether that reflection was accurate or simply what Richard needed it to be did not matter. What mattered were the results of that favoritism, which played out across 3 decades in thousands of small moments that Ethan absorbed without complaint. A dinner conversation about the company's future where Marcus was addressed directly and Ethan was not. A summer internship Richard arranged for Marcus while Ethan was told to find his own path. A graduation gift of a new car for Marcus and a firm handshake and a card for Ethan. None of these moments in isolation would have left a lasting mark, but accumulated over 30 years, they built in Ethan Cole, a man who had learned to expect very little from the people who owed him the most. It is worth pausing here and acknowledging that parental favoritism, which consistently elevates one child at the expense of another, is not a rare circumstance. Research published by family psychologists and documented in numerous case studies across the United States has consistently shown that perceived favoritism in childhood homes is one of the leading contributors to fractured sibling relationships in adulthood. It also creates profound and lasting effects on the self-worth of the child who is overlooked. Ethan Cole was not unusual in experiencing this. What made his story different was what happened when his father died. Richard Cole died on a Tuesday morning in March of 2012. He was 69 years old. He had been diagnosed with advanced heart disease 14 months earlier and had kept that diagnosis almost entirely private, sharing it with his physician, his attorney, and, as it would later emerge through court testimony, his oldest son, Marcus. Ethan learned about the full severity of his father's condition from a phone call he received from the family attorney, a man named Victor Hale. On the same morning, Richard was taken to the hospital for the final time. He did not learn it from Marcus. He did not learn it from anyone in the family home. He learned it from a lawyer. That detail, small as it seems on the surface, was the first thread in a fabric that, when fully unraveled, revealed years of coordinated and deliberate exclusion. The funeral was held that Saturday. Ethan stood graveside in the cold March air, and by all accounts he held himself together with remarkable composure. He shook hands, he embraced well-wishers. He stood beside Marcus, who delivered a brief and composed eulogy focused almost entirely on Richard's business legacy and said very little about the man himself. Ethan did not speak at the funeral. He had not been asked to. The people standing around him at that graveside, including his best friend of over 20 years, a man named Derek Shaw, and his fiancée of 14 months, a woman named Claire Hartwell, showed no visible sign that anything in their world was other than what it appeared to be. That appearance would not hold for long. 3 weeks after the funeral, Victor Hale called a formal meeting at his downtown Columbus law office to read the terms of Richard Cole's last will and testament. Ethan arrived expecting a straightforward proceeding. Richard had spoken to him generally about the estate on more than one occasion over the years, always in a way that suggested the business would ultimately be divided between his children in some fair proportion. Ethan had never been given specifics. He had not pushed for them, because pushing for things from his father had never historically produced results. He sat down in that conference room with careful neutrality, and within 20 minutes, everything he believed about his place in his own family was formally declared inaccurate by a legal document. The will, as read by Victor Hale, left 78% of the Cole estate, including majority control of the business, to Marcus Cole. It left a modest trust to Ethan's younger sister Sophia, sufficient for stable income, but carrying no decision-making authority over any part of the business. And it left Ethan Cole 12% of the estate, structured with a clause that made virtually every significant financial decision attached to that 12% contingent on Marcus Cole's formal written approval. It was not an inheritance, it was an allowance, the kind that required you to go, hat in hand, to the person who had always had everything, and ask permission before you could access what was supposed to be yours. Ethan did not protest in that conference room. Witnesses present would later describe him as appearing very still, not visibly distressed, not argumentative, simply very still. He signed the acknowledgement forms that Victor Hale placed before him. He drove home alone, and then he did something that, in retrospect, was the first quiet act of the man he would become over the next several years. He took out a notepad and began, systematically and methodically, to write down every single thing about the past 2 years that had felt wrong to him. He wrote down the fact that Marcus had known about their father's terminal diagnosis for over a year, while Ethan had not been told. He wrote down the fact that the terms of the will bore almost no resemblance to anything Richard had ever broadly indicated to him. He wrote down the fact that the attorneys' meeting had been scheduled with less than 4 days' notice, which was unusual for an estate of this size and complexity. He wrote down the fact that Marcus had shown almost no visible grief at any point during the funeral proceedings. He wrote it all down. Then he put the notepad in a drawer. He was not ready yet, but he was paying attention. And that attention would eventually change everything. What Ethan did not know at that point, what would take another 8 months and a private investigator named Ray Calhoun to uncover, was that the will he signed in Victor Hale's office was not the original. The original will had been amended 11 days before Richard Cole died. The amended version, the one that reduced Ethan's share and placed it under Marcus's control, had been executed at a time when Richard was heavily medicated, and according to medical records, later subpoenaed by Ethan's legal team, experiencing documented episodes of cognitive confusion related to his end-stage heart medication. The attending cardiologist at Riverside Methodist Hospital, where Richard spent his final 3 weeks, would later provide a written statement confirming that during the period the amended will was executed, Richard Cole had repeatedly failed to recognize nursing staff he had known by name for over a decade, and had on 2 separate occasions believed himself to be in a business meeting at his office rather than in a hospital bed. These were not the conditions under which a man revises the distribution of a $240 million estate. The question that now had to be answered was who knew that and moved forward anyway. The answer to that question is where this story becomes something that goes far beyond a family disagreement about money. Marcus Cole had been in private contact with Victor Hale for approximately 7 months before Richard's death. This was established through phone records and email correspondence that Ray Calhoun obtained through legal discovery and source interviews during his investigation. In those communications, Marcus had been providing Victor Hale with a carefully constructed and entirely false narrative about Ethan's intentions for the estate. He described Ethan as having expressed privately a desire to sell off portions of the business quickly after Richard's death, to liquidate assets rapidly, and to dismantle the company their father had spent 40 years building. None of this was true. There is no record anywhere, no text message, no email, no witness statement, no account from anyone who knew Ethan that supports any part of that characterization. But Marcus had been planting it systematically and persistently in Victor Hale's ear for months. And Victor Hale, a man who had served the Cole family for 30 years and whose loyalty to Richard's business legacy was, in his own words, the defining commitment of his professional career, had been listening. That, as legal scholars who have reviewed this case structure would later note, is a textbook example of what probate law categorizes as fraud in the inducement. It occurs when a beneficiary causes a testator's representative to alter estate documents based on deliberately false information provided about another heir. This form of manipulation exploits the trusted relationship between an attorney and a client, and it is among the most difficult forms of inheritance fraud to detect, precisely because the lies are told about a person who is not in the room to defend themselves. Ethan Cole could not walk into his father's hospital room during those final weeks and say that the things being said about him were not true. He did not know those things were being said. He had no idea that while he was visiting his father on Tuesday afternoons and bringing him the newspaper he always preferred, and sitting quietly beside his bed while Richard slept, Marcus was simultaneously meeting with Victor Hale in private and systematically rewriting the story of who Ethan Cole was and what he intended to do. Now we come to Derek Shaw. Derek Shaw had been Ethan's closest friend since the 3rd grade. They had grown up 6 blocks apart in a working-class neighborhood on the east side of Columbus. Derek was the kind of friend people mean when they talk about real friendship. The kind built when you are 9 years old and have nothing to offer each other except time and loyalty. Derek was there when Ethan's first serious relationship ended in their sophomore year of college. He was in the hospital waiting room when Ethan's mother had her surgery in 2007. He was the first person Ethan called when Claire Hartwell said yes to his proposal. Derek Shaw had been present at every single important moment in Ethan Cole's adult life, which is exactly why what Ray Calhoun found in the private investigator's report was so difficult to process. The report, which Ethan received on a Thursday afternoon in November of 2012, 8 months after his father's death, showed that Derek Shaw had been receiving monthly payments from an entity called Meridian Consulting Group. Meridian Consulting Group was a shell company registered in Delaware with a single actual beneficiary who, through 2 layers of corporate structuring, was connected to Marcus Cole's personal financial holdings. The payments had been going out to Derek Shaw for 4 years. They ranged in monthly value from $2,000 to as high as $6,000, depending on what billing records attached to the account described as consulting deliverables. Ray Calhoun cross-referenced those billing dates against events in Ethan's life and found a consistent pattern. The payments increased in months when Ethan was pursuing independent real estate investment deals or seeking legal consultation about his standing in the family estate. When Ray Calhoun presented this to Ethan, Ethan sat with the information for 2 full days before he did anything. He later described this as the period in which he had to decide what kind of person he was going to be with what he had learned, whether he was going to react or whether he was going to think clearly. He chose to think. He arranged to meet Derek at a diner they had been going to together since they were teenagers, a place called Rialto's on Broad Street that had been there since before either of them was born. He placed Ray Calhoun's report on the table between them and waited. Derek Shaw did not deny a single word of it. That, by accounts of the meeting, was perhaps the most difficult part for Ethan. He had half expected Derek to push back, to offer an explanation that complicated the picture, to say something that would make the story messier than it appeared. Instead, Derek sat across from him in that diner booth, and within less than 60 seconds, his composure gave way completely. He said he had not entered the arrangement with Marcus to harm Ethan. He said it had started with a single conversation in 2008, during a period when Derek was in a serious financial crisis related to medical costs for his daughter, who had been diagnosed with a significant illness requiring treatments his insurance would not fully cover. Marcus had approached him at a social event, had clearly known about the situation with Derek's daughter, and had offered what he framed as a simple arrangement. Derek would keep Marcus informed about any major plans or decisions Ethan was discussing privately. In exchange, Marcus would cover the bulk of the medical costs and continue to pay Derek a monthly retainer. Derek told Ethan that at the time, he had convinced himself the information he was passing along was harmless, that Marcus was simply a concerned older brother who wanted to stay informed. He said he had told himself this story for 4 years and had believed it long enough to get his daughter through her treatments. And then he said quietly, at some point he had known it was not true and had not stopped anyway. The silence that followed that admission, according to people who were aware of the meeting, lasted a long time. The legal framework here is important to understand. What Derek Shaw participated in constitutes, under U.S. civil law, tortious interference with prospective economic advantage. In practical terms, he was a paid participant in a scheme that repeatedly disrupted Ethan's ability to build financial independence outside of Marcus's reach. Every time Ethan had been close to securing a deal that would have given him resources of his own, Marcus received advance information through Derek and used his superior financial positioning and industry relationships to undercut those opportunities. On at least 3 documented occasions between 2008 and 2012, real estate transactions Ethan was pursuing collapsed in their final stages in ways that could not be explained by market conditions alone. Ray Calhoun later connected the failure of 2 of those 3 deals directly to behind-the-scenes interventions by entities tied to Marcus Cole's business network. Ethan Cole had not simply been passed over by his father. He had been systematically prevented from building the independence that would have made him difficult to pass over in the first place. And now we come to the part of this story that changes the entire shape of everything you have heard so far. Now we come to Claire. Claire Hartwell was 34 years old when Ethan proposed to her in December of 2011, 3 months before Richard Cole died. They had been together for 2.5 years at the time. They had met at a charity gala hosted by a Columbus Children's Hospital Foundation in the spring of 2009. Ethan had attended as a donor. Claire had been there as a volunteer, helping manage event logistics. They were introduced by a mutual acquaintance at the end of the evening. Ethan later said that what drew him to Claire initially was that she was the only person in a room full of well-dressed donors who looked genuinely interested in whether the event had accomplished what it set out to accomplish, rather than in whether she had been seen attending it. He said she had a quality of attention that he had rarely encountered in anyone. He fell in love with her methodically and fully. He proposed to her at a small dinner at her favorite restaurant, and she said yes before he had finished the sentence. Ray Calhoun's report included a section on Claire Hartwell that Ethan initially read as an error. The section documented 47 phone calls between Claire Hartwell's personal mobile number and Marcus Cole's mobile number in the 3 months between Richard Cole's death and the will reading. Ethan read it twice and set it down. He picked it up again the following morning. The calls ranged in length from under a minute to over 40 minutes. Several of them took place after 10 o'clock at night. Ethan engaged a second, separate investigator to verify the records independently. The records were confirmed in every detail. What Ethan discovered when he eventually confronted Claire was more complicated than anything he had prepared himself to hear. Claire Hartwell told him the full truth voluntarily before he had the chance to present the investigation results to her. She came to his apartment on a Sunday evening and told him everything from the beginning, without prompting. What she said was this. She had first met Marcus Cole in the spring of 2008, over a full year before she met Ethan. She had been introduced to Marcus through a professional contact who had no knowledge of the Cole family dynamics. At that time, Claire had been going through a difficult period in her professional life. She had left a law firm where she had worked for 6 years under circumstances that left her professionally vulnerable and financially exposed. Marcus had presented himself as a business connection, offering consulting work. Over several months, the nature of the arrangement had changed. Marcus had told Claire that he was concerned about his younger brother Ethan. He said Ethan was involved in dealings that could expose the entire family to serious legal and financial risk, and that he needed someone Ethan trusted to remain close to him and alert Marcus if anything concerning came up. He had backed this up with what appeared to be manufactured legal documentation showing Ethan's name connected to a federal financial inquiry from 2007. The documentation was entirely false, but Claire had not known that at the time, and Marcus had known exactly how to frame it so that a trained legal professional with no reason to question a convincing document would accept it as credible. The part of what Claire said next was what Ethan found the most difficult to hold. She told him that approximately 4 months after she began spending time with Ethan at Marcus's direction, she realized that the man Marcus had described to her bore absolutely no resemblance to the man she was actually getting to know. She said that within 6 months, she was no longer functioning as an informant in any meaningful sense. She was in love with Ethan Cole, and she had not told him any of this because Marcus had then shifted to a different form of pressure. He informed Claire that if she removed herself from Ethan's life or disclosed the arrangement to him, he would ensure the false federal documentation was submitted through channels that would damage Ethan's professional standing permanently and without recourse. Marcus had constructed a trap and then left Claire inside it, standing next to Ethan, with both of them simultaneously serving as instruments of his control. The 47 calls were not Claire reporting to Marcus. They were Claire, over 3 months, attempting to negotiate a way out of the arrangement without triggering the leverage Marcus held over her. She had been trying to find a path that did not destroy Ethan in the process. She had not found one on her own, and so she had come to Ethan directly with the truth. Because, as she told him that Sunday evening, she had decided he deserved to hear it from her rather than from a report prepared by someone he had hired to investigate the people he loved. It is important to note here that the manufactured documentation Marcus used to control Claire's behavior was itself a separate federal crime. The fabrication of records, designed to impersonate federal government proceedings, carries serious federal criminal penalties in the United States under statutes governing document fraud. This was not personal manipulation between two individuals. Marcus Cole had committed multiple federal offenses in the construction and maintenance of this scheme, and those offenses would become central to how the story ultimately resolved. Ethan Cole now held in his possession a full private investigator's report, a voluntary confession from his fiancée, an admission from his best friend of 22 years, a complete set of phone records, and 4 years of wire transfer documentation connecting Derek Shaw to Marcus Cole's Delaware shell company. He took all of it to a probate litigation attorney named Sandra Merritt, whose Columbus practice specialized in trust and estate fraud cases. Sandra Merritt listened to everything over 2 separate meetings and then told Ethan something he said changed his entire understanding of what had been done to him. She told him that what he was describing was not a family disagreement. It was a coordinated multi-year fraud scheme, and she told him that in her professional assessment, the amended will could be challenged on at least 3 independent legal grounds, any one of which, if proven, would be sufficient to have the entire document invalidated by the court. The 3 grounds were as follows. The first was lack of testamentary capacity, meaning that the evidence of Richard Cole's documented cognitive state in the period during which the will amendment was executed gave strong grounds to argue that Richard had not possessed the legal mental capacity required to bind a change to his estate documents at that time. The second was undue influence, meaning that Marcus Cole's ongoing private communication with Victor Hale, in which he provided systematically false characterizations of Ethan's intentions, constituted a classic exercise of undue influence over the estate planning process. The third was fraud in the inducement, arising from the same conduct but framed through the lens of deliberate deception, given that Marcus's representations to Victor Hale were not misunderstandings or exaggerations but fabrications constructed for the specific purpose of altering the distribution of a dead man's estate. Sandra Merritt filed the initial petition to contest the will in the Franklin County Probate Court in January of 2013. That filing set in motion a legal process that would take approximately 3 years to fully resolve and would, along the way, produce a revelation that none of the participants, not even Ethan, had fully anticipated. The first major development came 6 weeks after the filing. Victor Hale, who had retained his own separate legal counsel after the petition became public, made a decision that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the entire case. His attorney contacted Sandra Merritt's office and communicated that Victor Hale was prepared to cooperate fully with Ethan Cole's legal action. He would provide sworn testimony detailing the complete nature of his communications with Marcus Cole, the full timeline of those communications, and the specific misrepresentations Marcus had made to him regarding Ethan's intentions. Victor Hale was 68 years old at this point and had recently been diagnosed with early-stage cancer. His attorney communicated privately to Sandra Merritt that Victor Hale had concluded he did not wish the false will to stand as the last significant professional act of his career. His testimony, given over 4 formal deposition sessions between March and May of 2013, was extensive, precise, and corroborated in almost every material detail by the documentary evidence already assembled. Victor Hale confirmed that Marcus Cole had, over approximately 7 months, provided him with a sustained and detailed false account of Ethan's intentions. He confirmed that Marcus had framed this false account explicitly in terms of protecting the legacy Richard had spent his life building, knowing that this framing was precisely what would override Victor's professional judgment most effectively. He confirmed that he had facilitated the scheduling of the will amendment at a time when he was aware Richard was in a significantly diminished state. And then Victor Hale disclosed something that had not previously been part of any investigative record. He disclosed that approximately 3 weeks before Richard Cole died, Richard had called him from his hospital room and had told him in a conversation Victor had recorded out of professional habit that he was troubled by the changes that had been made to the will. Richard said he was not certain he had fully understood what he was signing, and that he wanted to speak with his son Ethan before any further action was taken on the estate. Victor Hale had not acted on this communication before Richard Cole died 3 weeks later. That recorded conversation, preserved on a small digital recorder that Victor had kept locked in his home office for nearly a year before producing it in the discovery process, became one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire proceeding. It established in Richard Cole's own voice that he had doubts about the amended will. It established that he had specifically named Ethan as the person he wished to consult before any further estate decisions were made. And it established, undeniably, that the final version of his estate document did not reflect his clear and unambiguous intent at the time it was executed. The case proceeded through depositions and pre-trial motions over the next 18 months. Marcus Cole retained a team of 4 attorneys from one of Columbus's largest litigation firms. His legal strategy in the early stages was to characterize Ethan's challenge as a disappointed sibling's attempt to relitigate their father's legitimate final choices. This framing had surface credibility in the absence of the evidence emerging through discovery, and Marcus's team initially slowed the proceedings through procedural motions. But the discovery process is very difficult to obstruct when the opposing party holds a cooperating witness who was present for all of the relevant events. And as Victor Hale's deposition materials entered the formal record, the narrative Marcus's attorneys had constructed became progressively harder to maintain in front of a neutral court. The second major development came in late 2013. Sandra Merritt received a call from an attorney representing a federal agency. That call informed her that a parallel federal investigation had been opened into Marcus Cole's business activities, stemming from a separate whistleblower complaint filed by a former employee of one of Marcus's subsidiary companies. That complaint alleged securities irregularities and the fraudulent manipulation of property valuations used in federally regulated lending transactions. The federal investigation was not directly connected to the estate dispute, but as it developed over the following year, it produced financial records and communications that overlapped significantly with the evidence already assembled in Ethan's civil case. In particular, it produced documentation of the same shell company structure Marcus had used to route payments to Derek Shaw, which in the federal context was being examined as a potential vehicle for tax fraud in addition to its civil significance. Marcus Cole was formally informed of the federal inquiry in early 2014. His legal team's posture in the estate proceedings shifted noticeably in the weeks following that disclosure. The procedural delays decreased. The tone of communications between the legal teams became more measured. Sandra Merritt recognized the shift immediately for what it was. A man facing simultaneous civil and federal legal exposure operates from a fundamentally different position than a man who believes his only threat is a civil petition filed by a sibling. The trial itself began in the Franklin County Probate Court in February of 2015 and lasted 19 days. Primary witnesses included Victor Hale, whose live testimony closely tracked his depositions, a forensic document examiner who testified about the circumstances and timing of the will amendment's execution, Richard Cole's attending cardiologist, who provided detailed medical testimony about Richard's cognitive state during the relevant period, Ray Calhoun, who walked the court through the full investigative timeline and financial documentation connecting Derek Shaw to the shell company structure, and Claire Hartwell, who testified about the nature of her original arrangement with Marcus and about the fabricated federal documentation he had used to maintain leverage over her continued participation. Marcus Cole testified in his own defense. His testimony did not serve him well. Under cross-examination by Sandra Merritt, who had spent 3 years preparing for this proceeding in careful detail, his explanations for the communications with Victor Hale were circular and internally inconsistent. His characterizations of his concerns for his father's legacy were directly contradicted in several specific instances by documentary evidence that Merritt produced from the discovery record. On the third day of cross-examination, when Merritt confronted him with an email in which Marcus had explicitly described to a business associate the financial benefit he would personally derive from restructuring Ethan's inheritance share, Marcus Cole stopped answering and conferred with his attorneys for 11 minutes. When the conference ended, his lead attorney informed the court that Marcus Cole was exercising his Fifth Amendment right not to answer the question. He invoked that right on 7 additional questions before Merritt concluded her cross-examination. The jury returned its verdict after 4 days of deliberation, finding in favor of Ethan Cole on all 3 grounds of the will contest. The amended will was invalidated in its entirety. The court ordered the estate to be redistributed under the terms of the original will, a certified copy of which Sandra Merritt had obtained from a separate estate attorney. Richard Cole had consulted privately in 2009, 3 years before his death and 3 years before Marcus had any knowledge of the document's existence. That original will left the majority of the Cole estate to Ethan Cole. It left Marcus a structured buyout of his business interests at fair market value, payable over 5 years. It left Sophia Cole a substantial independent trust with full and unrestricted access, and it contained something attached to the back of the document that no one in the courtroom had known to expect: a handwritten note in Richard Cole's distinctive script on a separate page. It read in its entirety: "For Ethan, I know I did not say it enough. I should have said it every day. I am proud of you. Everything I built was meant to reach you. I am sorry it took this long." That note was not entered into the trial record as formal legal evidence. Its authenticity, while not disputed by anyone who examined it, could not be verified through document examination at the standard required for evidentiary admission. Sandra Merritt made the decision to reference its existence in her closing argument without formally introducing it as an exhibit. She told the jury that the man they had spent 3 weeks hearing about had never once been told by his father that he was valued. She told them that the original will, in every material respect, showed that Richard Cole had known exactly what he was doing and exactly who he was leaving his life's work to, before the scheme that stripped that gift away from his son was constructed around him during the final weeks of his life. She told them that what they had been asked to decide was not simply a legal question about a document. It was a question about whether the wishes of a man who no longer had a voice were going to be honored, or whether they were going to remain overridden by 11 years of calculated work by the person standing to benefit most from his silence. The verdict was delivered at 11:37 in the morning, on a Wednesday in March of 2015. Ethan Cole sat in the courtroom with Sandra Merritt on one side and his sister Sophia on the other. The presiding judge read the jury's finding aloud. When the final sentence was delivered, Sophia reached over and took her brother's hand. Ethan sat completely still, in the same way witnesses had described him, sitting in Victor Hale's conference room 3 years earlier when the fraudulent will was first read to him. The stillness looked identical from the outside, but it was an entirely different kind of stillness. The first one had been the stillness of a man absorbing a wound. This one was the stillness of a man who had been proven right about everything. Now here is the part of this story that most people who hear it do not expect. The part that changes the shape of everything that came before it. During the trial proceeding, something emerged that had been sitting beneath the surface of this entire story from the very beginning, completely invisible to everyone, except the 2 people who knew it. Sandra Merritt, while preparing her closing argument, asked Victor Hale one final question during a preparatory session that was not part of any formal deposition. She asked him whether, in 30 years of serving the Cole family, he had ever been in contact with anyone outside the immediate family circle regarding the estate. Victor Hale paused for a long time before answering, and then he said yes. He said he had been in regular contact for the past 8 years with a woman named Diane Cole, Ethan's mother. Diane Cole had left the family when Ethan and Sophia were children. She and Richard had divorced when Ethan was 11 years old. She had relocated to Florida and, as far as either child had known, had had almost no contact with any member of the family for over 15 years. Ethan had long since made peace with her absence. He did not hate her. He simply did not factor her into the architecture of his life, which was, it emerged, precisely what she had intended. Diane Cole had not disappeared from this family's story. She had relocated to the perimeter of it and had been watching it from there, carefully and quietly, for over a decade. She had remained in private contact with Victor Hale, not because she was pursuing her own interests in the estate, but because Richard Cole himself had asked her to. In the final years of his life, Richard Cole had reached out to his former wife, the woman he had driven away with the same coldness and favoritism that had marked his relationship with his children. He had told her what he knew. He had told her what Marcus was doing, and he had told her that he did not trust himself to fight it from inside a hospital bed in his final months. He had asked her to be the person who watched from the outside and made sure the right things happened after he was gone. Diane Cole had contacted a federal investigator named Patricia Voss 18 months before Richard died. She had provided Agent Voss with the first documentation of Marcus Cole's business irregularities. Documentation she had obtained through Victor Hale, who had been feeding her information about the estate's financial movements at Richard's quiet direction. She was the origin of the federal whistleblower case. She had not filed it herself, because doing so would have made her presence in the story visible and given Marcus the opportunity to discredit her before the evidence was fully assembled. She had instead guided it to a former employee of Marcus's, who had sufficient standing to file the complaint independently and credibly. The woman Ethan had believed was simply absent from his life had been for 8 years running a quiet, patient, and entirely invisible parallel operation to protect him. She had done it from a distance because she understood, with more clarity than anyone else in this story, that being visible in it would make her a target before the groundwork was laid. She had done what she calculated would actually work, rather than what would have felt more satisfying to do directly, and she had been right. The federal case she seeded ultimately produced the financial records that corroborated the civil trial's most significant evidence. Without her work, the shell company structure connecting Marcus to Derek Shaw might never have been fully documented in a form the court could use. Ethan Cole drove to Florida to see his mother 2 weeks after the verdict. He arrived unannounced. She was not surprised. She told him she had known this day would come since the morning she had first called Victor Hale 8 years earlier. Ethan sat across from her in her kitchen for several hours. He did not ask her why she had stayed away for so long. He has never spoken publicly about what was said during that visit. What is known is that Ethan Cole drives to Florida twice a year, and that his mother answers the door before he reaches it because she always knows when he is coming. Marcus Cole was separately charged by federal prosecutors in September of 2015 on 14 counts, including securities fraud, wire fraud, and the fabrication of federal documents in connection with the manufactured records used to leverage Claire Hartwell. He entered a negotiated plea agreement in February of 2016, receiving a federal sentence of 11 years in custody. He served 7 years with credit for partial cooperation in the broader financial investigation, which resulted in charges against 2 additional individuals connected to his business network. He did not contact Ethan or Sophia following his release. As of the most recent available public record, Marcus Cole resides in a small community in central Nevada and maintains no active business interests. Derek Shaw was not criminally charged. His cooperation with both the civil proceedings and the federal investigation, combined with the nature of his role as a paid informant rather than an architect of the scheme, placed him outside the threshold for prosecution under the relevant statutes. He returned, in full, every dollar he had received from Marcus Cole's shell company, totaling just over $114,000. He directed that repayment, at Ethan's request, and without any legal requirement to do so, to a charitable foundation Ethan established supporting a youth recreation program in their Columbus neighborhood. Derek Shaw and Ethan Cole did not resume their friendship in the immediate aftermath of the verdict. 2 years later, Ethan called Derek on a Wednesday evening. Derek answered on the first ring. Claire Hartwell's trial testimony was credited by legal observers as one of the most consequential individual contributions to the outcome of the proceedings. Her account of the manufactured federal documentation was critical in establishing the criminal fraud dimension of Marcus's conduct, which in turn supported the most serious grounds of the civil will contest. After the trial, Claire returned to legal work and eventually established a small practice focused on elder financial abuse cases, drawing directly on her first-hand experience of being used as an instrument in exactly that kind of abuse. She and Ethan Cole remained connected after the proceedings concluded. Neither has spoken publicly about the nature of that connection in any detailed way. What is known is that they continue to have a relationship, and that what it looks like belongs entirely to them. Sophia Cole, who had been excluded from any leadership role in the business under both the original and amended will, had quietly used the years of litigation to complete an advanced degree in real estate finance. She was named co-chief executive of Cole Property Group by Ethan following the estate redistribution. Analysts who tracked the Columbus commercial real estate market in the years following described the company's performance under Ethan and Sophia's joint leadership as significantly stronger and more strategically coherent than it had been under Marcus's sole control. A trade publication ran a profile of Sophia in 2018 under the headline, "The Cole Who Was Hiding in Plain Sight." She kept the article framed on the wall of her office. Victor Hale retired from legal practice in the summer of 2015. Several months after his trial testimony concluded, he wrote a private letter to Ethan, several pages in length, that arrived by certified mail. Ethan read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same drawer where he kept his father's handwritten note from the original will. He has not discussed the contents of either document with anyone. Now, before we move forward, let us take a moment, because what you have just heard is not constructed for entertainment alone. The patterns in Ethan Cole's story, the coordinated manipulation of an aging parent's estate documents during a period of diminished cognitive capacity, the use of trusted personal relationships to gather intelligence on a targeted family member, the leverage of manufactured documentation to control another person's behavior, these are patterns that appear with documented regularity in real probate litigation records and elder financial abuse complaints filed across the United States every single year. The National Center on Elder Abuse has reported that financial exploitation of older adults costs victims in the United States more than $36 billion annually. The majority of those cases involve a family member. The majority of the family members involved are people the victim trusted deeply, and the majority of victims never see the full picture until far too late to recover what was taken from them. Ethan Cole saw the full picture. It took him 3 years and every ounce of methodical patience he had spent a lifetime building, but he saw it. And when he did not become the version of himself that his circumstances would have more than justified. He did not pursue Marcus Cole beyond what the law required. He took what the courts confirmed was rightfully his, built something real with it, and made sure that every person who had been genuinely wronged by the same scheme was made as whole as the situation allowed. In a story filled entirely with people who chose short-term advantage over long-term integrity, Ethan Cole chose the opposite at every single decision point available to him. And that choice, quiet and consistent and made entirely without an audience, is what this story is ultimately about. Not the betrayal, not the fraud, not even the verdict. It is about what a person does when they have every reason to become the worst version of themselves, and they choose deliberately and at real personal cost to become something better instead. If this story reached you today, leave a comment below. Tell us what moment in Ethan Cole's story stayed with you the longest. We read every single comment and we mean that. And if you are not subscribed yet, please do it now. The next story we are bringing you involves a woman who discovered, after 17 years of marriage, that her husband had been living under a name that was not his own, that the house, the business, the children's school records, the mortgage, every single document tied to their family had been built on a legal foundation that did not exist. And the person who found out first was not a detective or an attorney. It was her own mother, who had known for 11 years and said nothing. That story is coming. Make sure you are here for it.